Hello, and welcome back again to whatever it is we do together on Sunday nights uh, through a computer screen. I appreciate you all tuning in once again and just kind of being with me on this journey of exploring various themes and topics and what have you. This is usually kind of more of an opportunity for me just to talk about stuff that's just kind of on my mind that I don't really have the opportunity or chance to preach about as frequently. Some of it wouldn't make for good sermon material, but it makes for good just kind of whatever this is. It's kind of more dialogical in nature, more discussion oriented in nature. Yeah, and we've explored lots of different things. I find myself these days, just to confess, these birds are quite loud today. It's quite beautiful. Um, I start these series and I decide to shift gears and go into something else. And some of the series are quite lengthy, some of them are shorter in nature. Some of them are just a week long when I have this sense maybe I want to do a series about something and it lasts one Sunday night. Um, that's okay too, I guess. I guess after all, I'm the person with the camera, so I can kind of talk about whatever I want to talk about, and you have the option of tuning in or not if the subject matter interests you. I think what I'm going to start doing, I think I want to. They are very loud. I think what I would like to start doing is kind of have more of like an umbrella theme to this Sunday night kind of devotional, me talking, meditation, whatever you want to call it. I'm going to call it the chopping block. Because oftentimes, again, it's stuff that I feel like I would love to say in a sermon context, but it just doesn't make it quite that far. It doesn't jive with the theme. It's like maybe things that are kind of bouncing around in my head as I prepare for sermons or having various discussions with people throughout the course of the week, but it just never quite makes it into a public setting. But oftentimes these Sunday night reflections are things that are in the back of my mind as I'm preaching a sermon or leading a teaching of some sort. And so, but they never make it. They get chopped, right? And it doesn't mean they're not good. It just sometimes means that they don't pertain to the subject matter at hand, or the thing that I'm trying to focus on. And so I think from here on out, I'm just going to call Sunday nights, this whole thing we're doing together, the chopping block. And it's stuff that, yeah, it's just bouncing around in my noggin. It might be kind of a series in nature. It most likely at this point is going to be a fusion of various things. So like we've done things like quotes to live by, and reflected on some of the radical teachings, little one-liners of some various saints. We focused on spiritual practices and self-care tips and things like that from a kind of Christian mystical perspective. And we'll probably dabble in that. I had the intentions of doing a whole creation care series because that's the theme of this season, this liturgical season at church for us. But I'm not interested in talking about creation care tonight, so I'm not going to. Instead of trying to force it, maybe I'll talk about something that really resonates with me in the moment. And I found myself this week kind of lamenting, because we are doing a creation care kind of series and a season, so I felt the need to preach something creation care oriented, something about Mother Earth, and what Mother Earth has to teach us and how Mother Earth can heal us and guide us, right? And God's Spirit working through our planet and our world. And that's rightfully so. I need to preach on that on Sunday mornings because that's the season we're in. But I kind of felt myself really lamenting. I wasn't able to bring James, the reading from James for today, into the discussion. There was just I could not make a connecting point between what James was saying and the care of creation. And if you recall, or if you were present in church or keeping up with the readings in the lectionary, James was reflecting on basically the dangers of the tongue, how pretty much every species of animal on this planet has been tamed in one way or another by humankind, but the tongue is the one thing that we have yet to be able to tame. And James says that we teachers, those of us who are ordained, we are held to higher standards, and we will be judged more critically, with a more critical eye, if you will, because we are the ones who are doing the teaching about the divine. He doesn't really elaborate on what that judgment will look like or what that means necessarily. He just states it as a matter of fact, that those of us who are clergy will be judged more strictly because we are the ones who go about talking about God, more so than other people do. And we're the ones, at least, who have the authority to do so, and we can't abuse our authority, right? And then James likens the tongue to like a tiny fire that can set a whole forest ablaze, right? Just with one little spark, which is quite remarkable imagery. And we probably have all been on the receiving end of a forest ablaze, words of fire that have set just, all kinds of things ablaze. We probably also have been people who have perpetuated those types of fires where we think we're just spitting out a tiny spark at somebody and then it erupts into this huge thing that we never intended, right? Words matter, and how we say things matters. But I think James oftentimes gets misinterpreted. He does talk about how, right, there's the dangers of saying things that are false or not helpful, and how destructive that can be. Oftentimes when people get to that section, they interpret James's thoughts on the speech of leaders, the tongues, and the preaching and proclamation of clergy. They often interpret it in that whole section in light of the section that follows. And I think that, well, there's probably something helpful to that. I actually think James is saying something kind of altogether different in that first section, as he was reflecting on the responsibility that we clergy have when it comes to talking about God, and the dangers that are there, and the reality of all of that, the weight of it. And I don't think James is just talking about how false teachers will be judged more severely. I think one of the points he's actually making is that all of us who have the authority, have been given the authority to teach, to proclaim, who have had this recognized communal authority bestowed upon us to teach about God, I think part of what James is actually saying is that all of our teaching about God, in one form or another, is actually all of it false teaching. I'm reminded of the famous story at the end of Thomas Aquinas' life, which many people know about or have heard about in one version or another. So supposedly at the end of St. Thomas Aquinas' life, after he had cranked out a boatload of theological works and sermons and things of that nature, and been very active, actually had been an activist in so many ways, and a philosopher in so many ways, incredible ways. Definitely one of the most, he had made his mark on the Western world, for sure, at this point. But by the end of his life, he had some kind of experience while he was praying the Eucharist or leading the liturgy one day, where it just rendered him completely mute. And he never wrote or spoke again about God, or at least in the same way. And a lot of people will think that maybe he had a stroke or some sort of physical happening, some kind of ailment that hit him, where he wasn't able to speak or to write anymore, or to function in that way anymore, as basically a priest or a theologian would. Others would say, though, that he must have had some kind of mystical experience of Christ, and that was the thing that rendered him mute, where he no longer wanted to speak about God. And in fact, when people asked him why he had stopped doing what he was doing, because he was a pretty popular and well-known figure, and controversial for sure figure at the time, but when his kind of fan base, when his followers, when his supporters asked him why he stopped doing what he was doing, he said all of his works up until that point in his life, they just seemed like straw. Seemed like basically nothing. Which is amazing to think about. One of the most significant thinkers, not just in the history of Christianity, but in the history of the Western world, a cornerstone of Western philosophy and thinking and theology, looked back on his own works and felt like it was essentially nothing, just straw. And one of his pupils, somebody who was an admirer of Aquinas and within the same spiritual tradition, he actually, I think, probably picking up on what Aquinas was saying here, and the reality of the end of Aquinas' life, he went on to say that anybody who opens their mouth to speak about God lies. Which may sound like a startling statement. And I think as I was reading James this week about how we teachers are going to be judged more strictly or more severely, and the dangers of the tongue and the dangers of speech, especially when that speech is about God, I believe about myself that pretty much all of the teaching that comes out of my mouth is false teaching. Other people who don't like my liberalism or my progressiveness or my Episcopalianness would probably amen that one, right? But I don't mean it that way. I don't mean that everything that I'm saying, I'm not trying to lead people astray or fool people or what have you. But it's just, I know full well and feel the weight of the reality that my words have limitations, that my words are not vehicles that are sizable enough to actually convey that which is divine. There's nothing that I can say, no matter how well or accurately I can say it, that will actually be able to ever come close to even articulating God's glory and the majesty of the divine. So all words said about God, they fail more than they succeed, because none of these words said about God, again, regardless of how beautiful or great or accurate they may be, none of them can contain the fullness of God. God is always beyond what human language can say, even the most pronounced and articulate language. And I think that's what James has in mind. That there's dangers in speaking falsely about God, for sure, but even speaking truth about God, there is a danger in that. There's danger in even there's more danger in saying a lot about God, a lot of true things about God, than there is in saying nothing about God. And I'm reminded of the famous wisdom saying from the Desert Fathers, which I shared this morning in my sermon, about Abba, or Father Pombo. I love saying his name, Pombo. When the bishop came to visit the monastic community that Father Pombo was a part of, some monks came to Father Pombo because he was well known as like a wisdom teacher, kind of a guru type. And people came to him from all over the place to seek his advice and his counsel and his direction. So as the bishop's visiting, these monks come up to Father Pombo, wanting to impress the bishop more than likely, right? So they come up and say, Father Pombo, speak a word of wisdom to the bishop so that he might be edified or encouraged. I think what they really mean is enlightened, right? He might have his eyes opened more to the reality of the divine through Father Pombo's words. This is what the monks wanted. And Father Pombo's response was that if the bishop is not edified by my silence, he will not be edified by my speech. That holy silence speaks of God more clearly and accurately than any word could ever convey. There's real wisdom in that. And I think there's a real lesson to be learned for those of us who consider ourselves religious, who consider ourselves Christians, who are churchy, especially if we come from a more evangelical-ish background, where we're kind of commissioned to go and talk at people about God and proselytize them and evangelize them, right? According to a lot of the wisdom of historic Christianity, even if we're well-intentioned and we want to benefit people with our proclamations about God and our evangelizing, sharing the good news of Jesus Christ with them, our words can do way more harm than good. They can actually lead people astray more than they can convey the divine. And I think what a lot of these great saints and mystics throughout history would say is that it's way more important to actually cultivate a deep prayer life where you're embodying God's presence. And God's presence just kind of oozes out of you. And that is the speech about God that your life gives. That is the sermon that your life proclaims. It's the famous saying that's oftentimes attributed to St. Francis. I've heard that it's not actually his saying, but I don't care. It's a good saying. And it sounds like something Francis would say. Is that the saying is preach always and sometimes use words. And there's a lot of wisdom in that. And it's not that we don't love God. It's not out of a hard-heartedness or a lack of belief or faith where we decide we don't want to speak about God all the time or so much. It's actually out of a deep reverence and realizing our own limitations and the limitations of our words that we choose wisely to abide more in silence than we do in vocal evangelism or vocal theologizing publicly, right? Or even interpersonally. So it's not just, James's point is not just be careful of what you say about God, but be careful of how much you talk about God. So, yeah, because even good words can be deceptive because of their limitations. Well, thanks for tuning in. As always, I think that's all that I have to say this week. I'm sure you will think of something much wiser and much deeper than I have. That's my hope, at least. So, peace. God bless you.